Welcome to the Dad Lit Pod, the literary podcast for people who remind you to call your mother on her birthday. Today I'm joined by Bob Armstrong. Bob is an Alberta born writer living in Winnipeg, near the geographic center of North America. He has worked in small town newspapers, university public relations, government speech writing, and environmental impact report writing, and has written creative work in just about every genre but poetry and ransom notes. His first novel, Dadolescence, from Turnstone Press, was a male focused domestic comedy about a procrastinating would be academic and stay at home father trying to make sense of his life and the lives of similarly lost fathers. Think Nick Hornby with a Canadian accent. His second novel, Prodigies, was a shift in time, space, and genre to New York and the Dakota Territory of the 1870s. Prodigies, published by Maine-based Five Star Publishing in 2021, focused on a trio of gifted youths wandering through Gilded Age America and finding common cause in fighting for the future of the nation. Imagine Lonesome Dove with hints of Gangs of New York and the Young X-Men. A new paperback and ebook edition of Prodigies is scheduled for this fall from the Hat Creek imprint of Arkansas-based publisher Roan and Weatherford, and a sequel to Prodigies, which will bring back many of the characters for a new trip through the Old West, is in the works. Bob and his wife Rosemary have one son, Sam, who acts as their mountain guide when they visit him in Canada's climbing mecca of Squamish, British Columbia. Welcome to the pod, Bob.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning. So, you, well, I went out and got my own copy of Dadolescence. I haven't read Prodigies, but I'm certainly intrigued. Why don't you tell me about what inspired you to write Prodigies and maybe a little more about the book itself and what's in it?
Sure. Prodigies is my second novel, and the sequel then will make number three. Uh, it's kind of an odd origin story. I was also a playwright. I wrote a number of plays on the what's called the Fringe Festival circuit. Uh, Here in Winnipeg and a few other Canadian cities, fringe festivals are quite popular. And as a writer, it's a great way to get your work out before the audience. So I wrote plays, I sometimes directed them. And I was working on a play, weird historical epic about a man called Louis Riel, who was a leader of the Métis, the mixed race people in Western Canada in the 19th century, led a resistance movement against Canada taking over the Northwest, and later on a sort of a failed rebellion in Saskatchewan. And is one of the major events in Canadian history. Little known story is that he spent a lot of time in the U.S. trying to get American support for, a revolution in what's now Western Canada. He actually appears to have had a meeting with Ulysses S. Grant, wanted to get American support for this. Anyway, that's a long backstory. So I had all this research I was working on for this play. It was all taking place in the 1870s. Part of it was taking place in New York. And that brought me into reading the original Gangs of New York, which was a allegedly nonfiction story about the wild days of 19th century New York City. And somehow out of all that, I had this idea of a Western that would bridge the East, the rough and tumble Five Points district of Manhattan, and the West, specifically Deadwood, which I'd visited on a trip to the Black Hills.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd had this vision of a story set in a mining town with a fanatical mining magnate, and almost like eventually came up with the idea of crossbreeding that just a little bit with a superhero story, not full-fledged superheroes, but young people with somewhat uncanny gifts. And before I knew it, I had this trio of teenagers, one with super fast hand-eye coordination, basically making him a natural gunslinger. One with uncanny abilities or just a brilliance in mechanical and mathematical thinking, making him a natural engineer and inventor. And another one with a kind of mental link with canines so that she can kind of talk to dogs and wolves. It sounds absurd. And anyway, these three come together, and before you know it, they're kind of a team fighting a fanatical, as I say, mining magnate who has this idea of more or less, creating a kind of oligarchy in the United States through military and financial power. Who could think that would happen?
And so it does sound like young X-Men.
It does kind of. I mean, it's
Yes.
got your classic discovering your powers scene in one or two cases. It
Yes.
also connects with actual history from the period. So as I say, this started off. I was thinking of a play. It became a way too big and unwieldy to be a
Mm.
play, and then eventually I abandoned all the Louis Riel stuff, and it just became this novel covering. Sort of the Odyssey from New York and the Midwest to Deadwood. But yeah, there is a bit of superhero to it, but not too much. Just that they have, as I say, uncanny gifts. They discover their powers. They are thrown together by fate as their paths lead them to this small mining boomtown in 1877, I guess it is, that they're there. Sort of spring of 77. I have the timeline in my head
Yeah.
because Wild Bill Hickok is killed in 76 and they're there the next year.
Yes. Aces and eights, the dead
Yep,
man's
for sure.
hand.
Yeah.
Uh, the so here's a question. The Western genre, uh, to this point, obviously, it, I'll call it a singular North American genre, right?
Yeah.
How do you envision keeping the Western genre fresh and also adhering to its staple elements of shootouts and those sorts of things?
I mean, the genre just keeps reinventing itself all the time,
Mm.
and but a lot of that stuff is stays with it. I mean, I think what keeps it fresh is, and what attracted me to the novel is that this period, post Civil War, the 20 years or so post Civil War, is such a mirror to our times. I mean, I guess all historical novelists kind of tend to say this, whether they're talking about the late Middle Ages or the Renaissance, but I think it's particularly the case with the late 19th century, especially in the US. It really is the beginning of so much that is our current way of life. You have the proliferation of mass media, the dime novel phenomenon, the touring vaudeville shows and stage shows. You have the country is stitched together by railroads. I think 1860. I always forget if it's 68 or 69 is when the Transcontinental Railroad is built in the U.S. And soon you have networks of railroads really stitching the entire country together. So in this short period of time, you have the creation of so much that is our current way of life. That you have these celebrities, you have celebrity culture really created in a new way in the late 19th century because you have mass media and because you have the ability to bring the country together through transportation that you never had before that. And so we look at that period and we see our own times to a much greater extent than if you look back 300 years, 200 years. And then, of course, it's the founding of so much electrification, telephone. These are all being worked on at that same time. The early forerunners of the automobile. People were working on steam-driven, sort of horseless carriages, in the 1870s already. I work that into the novel. That electrification. Edison is at work. The uh, the telephone is being developed, and I sort of bring in mentions of the telephone in the sequel. That you look at that period, and you see that a lot of our culture as we live it was coming together in a way that you don't looking at an earlier time, and I find that fascinating.
Yeah. How does so you're writing an American Western.
Yeah.
How does the Western experience the same and different do you find from the Canadian Western experience and Canadian westward expansion? I think it's interesting because obviously it's from Deadwood, it's a few hundred miles to the north, and there's a lot of expansion and development going on up there as well.
Yeah, there's a number of differences. Obviously, part of them come from geography.
Hmm.
In American westward expansion, once the first settlers made it over the Appalachian Mountains, kind of Daniel Boone era, there wasn't really anything to stop them.
Hmm.
You had fertile land once they get into Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, fertile land, and so you had immediately immediately after the American Revolution, increasing push for people to start settling. And once then they're settled in Ohio, you have the push to move further and further and further. I don't have the number in front of me, but I think Missouri must have been settled sort of immediately after the Louisiana Purchase. So they're crossing the Mississippi really early. Canada, um, you had the early Anglo settlers, many of them refugees from the American Revolution in southern Ontario. But you get about 100 miles north of Toronto, and you hit a geological phenomenon called the Canadian Shield, which is basically a vast area of granite with a thin layer of soil, and it's interspersed with bogs. And that really runs from about 100 miles north of Toronto till 50 miles, 60 miles east of Winnipeg, that entire area of Ontario. So there was really no ability for settlers to travel Canada that way. That it was just such an impediment to settlement. So there wasn't any Canadian westward movement by individuals until really the 1870s. What happened in the Canadian West was it was it had been granted by Britain to the Hudson's Bay Company, which is a trapping company, a fur trading company. And so basically, it was a corporate colony. The only Europeans in there were employees of the Hudson's Bay Company, and
Hmm.
some when they retired might settle on little farms. But so you didn't have this mass movement of settlers, which then would attract the kind of conflict that propels the Western. I mean, nobody was setting up ranches and then having cattle wars over their ranches. Nobody was then founding small towns which would have banks that a Canadian James gang could rob. So it's a very different Western development. And then famously, once the Canadian government, Canada becomes a country in 1867, uh, uh, 6 years later, they formed what was then the Northwest Mounted Police, and the Mounted Police come out. And before there's any kind of large-scale Canadian settlement in the West, the police have established a presence there. So it was a deliberate effort to have law before you had settlement. So again, although Canadian mining towns, let's say, could be pretty rough, you didn't have the kind of uh, Hobbesian life in a state of nature that you might have in someplace in Texas or New Mexico or Arizona during that period. So it makes for a very different West. At the same time, this is a long answer. At the same time, there's a whole lot of cross-border action. A lot of Canadians did move south at various times, and there was back and forth. So you had the French-speaking Métis in a lot of cases, many of them were worked as guides. I mean, that was uh, the Lewis and Clark expedition had a Red River
Hmm.
Métis guide. Was his wife was Sacagawea. You had Canadians in the West, such as the sheriff in Deadwood, Seth Bullock, uh, uh, lawman, oh man, I'm blanking on the names, but two lawman brothers in Dodge City who were contemporaries of Wyatt Earp. I mean, you had a Canadian presence because in Canada the economy was somewhat stagnant at that time. So there was a lot of action going across the border, Canadians settling down there because there wasn't that option of settling in the Canadian West. So it creates a natural kind of interest for a Canadian writer to look south because Canadian uh, lawmen, criminals, and settlers were also looking south.
The grass in this case is greener on the other side for a Canadian Western author.
Yeah, there's a whole genre of Canadian cross-border westerns. Kind of our
Mm.
one of our greatest novelists. He has focused on the cross-border experience, and I mean one of the key things in the creation of the Canadian West that led to the founding of the RCMP was the Cypress Hills Massacre. A group of wolf hunters from Fort Benton, Montana, chased a group of, I believe they were Assiniboine First Nations people who had stolen their horses and caught up with a different group in the Cypress Hills, which is a hill area in southern Saskatchewan, attacked them and killed 30 of them or so, quite a large number. And that created a lot of pressure to create the RCMP, well, the
Hmm.
Northwest Mounted Police, as it was then called, and so one of our greatest novels, The Englishman's Boy, it's called, was about that and about that cross-border presence. There've been a lot of other Canadian westerns that have had that sort of thing of the people going back and forth over the border. There's another great one called The Trade about how the Hudson's Bay Company and American fur trappers were competing for control of the kind of Montana, Idaho, uh, part of the West before the border was firmly established.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've thought about writing my own Western. I had an idea for it, which was to take an old um, cattleman, an Indian fighter, and to put him on a merchant marine ship in World War I,
Oh yeah.
delivering cattle to the Japanese and to Russia. And I thought it would be interesting to do that and to have him show up with the American Arctic polar bear unit that helped extricate the Czech Legion,
Oh my
and
God.
and and to have him then subsequently be called upon to defend some people from red troops of the Russian Revolution. And I'm going to get around to it. But I thought it was funny that it wouldn't be a Western, it would be an Eastern.
Well, that's the thing about the Western genre. It's flexible that way too. That
Yes.
I mean, I'm thinking of as the Prodigies series continues, assuming the sequel does well enough that they want a third one of sending them south because Butch Cassidy and
Mhm.
the Sundance Kid end up in Bolivia, uh, and there's a lot of potential for that kind of thing, and likewise it extending the Western genre in time, into the 20th century. Not with my
Mhm.
characters because they no longer have the charm of youth, but I mean that sounds like a great story right there. I mean, um, and I think we see another thing that keeps the Western kind of fresh is certain characteristics of the Western
Yes.
hero. I mean, you see that kind of, whether you're talking about the lone, taciturn gunman, or the weathered guy who's been out there too long and has can't fit back into society again. You see that character come in all sorts of stories that take
Mhm.
place in the 20th and even 21st century. The old cowboy type. I mean, it's interesting that. there's a whole you could do a whole Spotify playlist of rock music where the singer is comparing himself to a cowboy, or where like he's the outsider riding the road, riding the roads instead of riding the trail. And
Yes.
I mean, it's a bit of a cliche even. So and there's a biker culture. I think they're really into the West, the idea of the Western hero. I mean, isn't there a biker magazine called Iron Horse?
Hmm.
So that's another thing I think that keeps the Western genre fresh. That you can apply that I don't know, hero template or villain template onto characters in other settings. But that's a
Hmm.
great one. It's also, since this is the dad lit pod, it's a great kind of a dad genre. I think the
Oh yeah.
Western.
Yeah.
Um,
It's I think dads love Westerns because there's an element of emerging morality about it.
yeah,
I've thought about it a lot, and sort of why dads like crime books, which is that they either like the escape of the criminal or the sort of the mind escape of the criminal, or alternatively the restoration of order
yeah,
by the police officer. And I previously had a conversation with J. Daniel Sawyer, who writes science fiction. And he brought up something to me which I thought was really interesting, has really stuck with me, which is that all mysteries are effectively about bringing order out of chaos.
hmm,
And I thought it struck me that a lot of the satisfaction that comes with the Western is both a wow, it was interesting when it was different and when it was lawless, but there's always the pressure of the law coming in,
hmm,
which is an interesting thing. I've started getting really interested in what attracts people to certain stories, for
yeah.
example, and the Western is definitely an area where that comes up a lot because some people just really love Westerns. Ike Eisenhower loved Westerns,
Oh yeah.
read Westerns. So, and of course, it, the most, I would say, one of the most prominent crime writers of the previous generation of crime lit, Elmore Leonard, wrote crime and wrote westerns. So it's
Yeah,
sort of,
his westerns have a lot in common. I mean, that tone, of his the way his dialogue works and all of that. You see
yeah.
that in his westerns as well as in his crime fiction.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah. So the plan, I guess, is to continue this Western motif with future Prodigies novels, correct?
yeah, that's definitely. The first one, they're in Deadwood. The second one, I've got them converging on well, the New Mexico territory, and I'm thinking of where the third one could take them.
Hmm.
The candidates include Montana and somewhere in Latin America. But if it works, I could continue it for a few. I also have a Western idea that's been kicking around in my head that's very much a Canadian Western, would be an entirely different cast of characters, and would be set during what's called the Caribou Gold Rush in central British Columbia, before it was British Columbia. So yeah, I've got just like you, I've got this idea kicking around in my head that would be a huge project to work on, but I keep thinking of it. Oh, I should really try to do that. But what you were saying about the order out of chaos. Uh, that's one of the central themes of the Western is, how do you create a society in a blank slate?
Hmm.
Where it's like the Hobbesian state of nature.
Yeah.
It's the war of all against all. You think of the American West. You've got this land that's available after the European diseases have decimated the original inhabitants, and people move in and start claiming land before there's any kind of authority, legal accepted authority. And how do you control that? How do you just the basics of running a society? And so the Western is often the story of the individual whose job is to tame it, but that is the person who goes in there to tame the West is not a person who, by personality or skills, is adapted to a tamed society. So in taming
Hmm.
the West, he puts himself out of a job. He identifies with the wild country he's moving into, at the same time as he's making it no longer wild. And it's often the tragedy of the Western. I'm currently rereading Lonesome Dove, and
Hmm.
so the both the main characters there, Gus McCrae and Woodrow Call, are not men adapted to a settled, tamed society. They've spent their whole lives taming a society, and they both often, especially Gus, uh, talk about that. Call doesn't really think about things as much, but Gus is a big talker and a big thinker, and he's often saying, uh, you know, we came in and tamed this land for what? To hand it over to the bankers, and that we fought the Indians and now we're the Indians is one of his lines. And that's sort of the tragedy of so many westerns. And I think that melancholy is part of what makes it sort of a dad genre. It's
Yep.
about how the past is irrecoverable. You look. It's about the fleeting youth of the West, because when you think about it, that classic American Western period, the cattle drive era, lasted less than 10 years, really.
Hmm.
The open range period was pretty much gone by 1880 with the invention of barbed wire, maybe even before that. And there's so much in the Western genre that's always, oh, this country's spoiled now. It's all fenced now. The buffalo are gone. Before that, it was the beaver are gone. Now there's towns everywhere. You can't wander where you want. All that, and you're looking back on this period from your youth. The characters are often doing that, and so as a father, you're often thinking of the fleeting nature of time. You're looking at your kid growing up, thinking back to your own youth, or you're thinking of, as your kid's growing up, thinking of your kid's youth, and how quickly time passes, and how quickly these periods that seemed they would last forever don't. And
Yeah.
I mean, that's such a common theme in so many westerns, both in print and on film. And it is such a common, I think, uh, kind of melancholy thought of dads.
Yeah, I like that idea of the Western being in a lot of ways an allegory for growing up because of course um I think an example of one of the examples of high dad lit is the book Old Yeller,
Oh yeah.
which is effectively a book about um becoming a father in a lot of ways and about learning what it takes to do that. And I don't know, did everyone in Canada have to read and watch Old Yeller when they were in school?
I think I remember it being on television, but I never read it. But it was
Yes.
such a ubiquitous thing. Everybody knows about it,
Yeah.
maybe in part because comedians are always referencing it and all of that kind of thing. But I'm
Well,
pretty sure I remember seeing it on TV.
it's funny. It's funny. I wrote an article about how the Wicked Witch of the West has been killed as a horror icon by our contemporary society. And what I what I went into is that back when we were kids in the analog days, you would see The Wizard of Oz once a year, or you would see Old Yeller on the Wide World of Disney, or whatever it was that Disney would air it on like a Sunday night. And that was a yearly event almost.
Hmm.
And it had power because, of course, you were a kid and you were alone and you saw it once and then you had to go to bed and then ruminate on the terrors of the thing.
Yeah, the flying monkeys.
The flying monkeys, this horrible witch who tried to light a girl on fire, and because we don't have that sort of mystique or power of that iconic character. Not to mention they did the Wicked in this case is a movie that recently came out. It was a play and it was also a book, which was meant to sort of be like, well, let's look at people from the other perspective. Let's use some perspective on villainous characters. At the same time, uh, the villain of the Wicked Witch of the West, like the story of Old Yeller, was a cultural touchstone that we
Hmm.
all shared. And it's a collective experience almost. Like watching the Zapruder film,
Yeah,
where we all do it and we all experience it. And it changes us as a people and also sort of binds us in a cultural moment. And I think I wonder if it, particularly in what we talk about, which is the atomized society, the contemporary atomized society, um, if those cultural touchstones, if we're not all sharing them, are we even sharing reality, right? If we're not all touching the hot rock
yeah,
at the same time, do we as a people have the ability to have a collective cultural experience?
yeah. No, I mean, certainly the 500 channel universe has taken that away, hasn't it? Like, you
Oh
look at,
yeah, no,
you'll
it's
hear about some show that's really popular and you realize you've never heard of it or never watched it.
yes,
Or you'll see somebody scheduled to be on the Super Bowl halftime show and they're huge. And
yeah,
you'll realize you've never heard a song by them. You have no idea what their music is. Maybe
no
that's part
clue.
of being an old fogey, but still, I mean, it's that everything from film to books to music uh,
Yes.
has just been so diversified that you can that there are these people who are celebrities, whole lists of celebrities you've never heard of, and the people you
Oh
think are
yeah,
really big and cool, and oh man, so and so, somebody else has never heard of, and so you don't have that common reaction to the stories, to the characters, and there
yeah.
isn't that. I think that's part of why. Um, Maybe that's part of why sports are still so important in broadcasting because that's one thing that everybody uh, is able to watch at the same time and share. If when the Super Bowl's on, or when the World Cup is on, or the Olympics are on, it's happening there. There's one place to see it. Everybody's hearing those same names. Whereas with all of the kind of fictional culture and entertainment culture, other areas, it's uh, there's so little common ground that we don't know the same things, hear the same things. It certainly has changed. I think it's changed us in a lot of ways. And it's
Oh
interesting when you
yeah,
talk about villains being made into heroes. There is a whole genre of that, isn't there? Because there's a lot of writers who've done that with the Beowulf story, doing it
yes.
from Beowulf's point of view or sorry, from Grendel's point of view and Grendel's mother's point of view.
Hmm.
There've been and there's been others oh well, I mean, think of what they did with vampires. Uh, you know, making
Yeah,
it. I
now
mean,
now
vampires always had a sexual element to them, I guess.
yeah, but it was
But it
one to
was
be rejected. You were
yeah,
supposed
yeah,
to reject the
yeah,
idea of an immortal realm where you did nothing but drink blood and have sex.
yeah,
You weren't supposed to want that.
yeah, yeah. That's true. And Have we had anything from? I'm trying to think what other points of view. But yeah, I think a lot of there's a uh, uh, whole genre in literature of okay, let's take this old story and flip it around.
Yes.
Uh, and I suppose that's a skepticism around grand narratives, the postmodernism and all of that.
Yeah, but this struck me. This was another thing because of course the Western genre has the anti-hero in it, for example. What I like to call the charming monster archetype. And I watched a show called You with my wife, which has a charming monster. And I've been watching so many charming monster television shows, and they've become to me, I now wonder what the charming monster show is and
Mm-hmm.
what the purpose of it is. And the to a point where I think so. For example, the movie Unforgiven. Let's use a Western as
Oh
an
God,
example.
I just rewatched that. Good
Yes,
idea.
movie Unforgiven is about a charming monster. And unlike these other things, which where oh we're how's he going to get out of this one, or how are they going to make it through? Unforgiven is about the rather stunning regret of what in your youth you do and what the anti-hero is. And it is and even at the end when he, we're not going to ruin it for everybody, but when the Western reporter wants to quiz him on all these things that he's just done and who he is, um, to sort of sell the idea of this wild, destructive force, and to take sort of a glee or an excitement in it. Uh, I wonder if that has, if you're not doing Unforgiven, to me, it's become very stale. Uh, I wonder how we as authors, for example, what we could do and how we could do the charming monster, but to make a comment about the audience and the audience's willingness to tolerate the charming monster. And I have been trying to integrate this idea into my own novels. And I don't know, what would what sort of, you know what I'm referring to in terms of
Yeah.
examples. I think Unforgiven is the best one because you develop sympathy for this person, and then you find out, oh, he's done horrible things.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Unforgiven's an interesting case study. I mean, you know, obviously Clint Eastwood's the star, and he was already huge by that time, so
Yes.
we just naturally are his fans. And right from the beginning, it tells us that he's not just so often the killer in a western. He's only
Yeah.
killed bad guys.
Yes.
He's been a fast gun, but he's only shot other fast guns or whatever. But they make it quite clear from the beginning that in the past he did terrible things. He and and he has for 10 years been trying to go straight thanks to the love of a good woman. This is all
Mhm.
very early in the setup, so I'm not giving
Yeah.
anything away. And so the film is about his being forced to go back to his old ways. And but it also kind of attempts to I guess turn a lot of conventions on their head. In that
Hmm.
he wasn't just a killer for good reasons. He wasn't just a person who killed bad guys. He doesn't have the glamour of the Western hero. The first time you see uh, Clint Eastwood's character in that movie, William Munny, I believe his name is, or
Yeah,
Mundy.
William Money. Yeah,
He's on his farm trying to get his pigs to go into a chute, and he falls in the mud. He's covered head to toe in mud, chasing pigs around.
yeah,
The first time he gets on his horse, again early in the movie, not a giveaway, he falls off the horse because he's more or less forgotten how to ride. So it kind
mhm.
of like takes every kind of trope you might expect of the Western, glamorous hero, the expert horseman, just tosses them out the window, throws them in our face, sort of. And it's
Yeah,
interesting the way it does that. It attempts to sort of de-romanticize the West, but it still can't, because it's still Clint Eastwood and horses and six guns and the beautiful Western scenery and it's the Western genre is kind of impervious to assault. It refuses to be deconstructed, no matter how hard you try. Uh, so it's but speaking of charming monsters, a really good example of that would be the assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford, which
yes,
was a
yes,
novel first and then a film. It comes through in the film, but it really comes through in the novel. The kind of a charismatic but also very dark nature of Jesse James. I mean, much of the time he's charming, but he's also completely ruthless.
yes,
And like some kind of mob boss, he'll kill people in his own gang who he fears are about to turn him into the Pinkertons.
yeah.
So he's got a lot of the psychology of Tony Soprano in him.
Hmm.
And another guy who's really a charming monster that we love to watch. We sympathize with, even though we know he does terrible things. So there's another example of how certain aspects of the Western can carry through into contemporary times, if we
Yeah.
consider Sopranos contemporary now in 2025. I'm old enough that I do.
Yes. Yeah. That's also a terrific movie with Casey Affleck and Brad Pitt, and
Oh yeah,
it's.
partially shot in Winnipeg, I should say.
I was gonna say Canada has, and as a location, because I think it's what Days of Beauty or the Terrence Malick film.
Oh, Days of Heaven.
Yeah, Days of Heaven. I saw that for the first time because I got interested in the cinematographer, and it's all filmed in Canada.
Yeah,
And I was like, in Western Canada, I'm like, and even much of the film, for those who haven't seen it, it is a Western, um, is supposedly set in Texas, but it's the setting is actually where they filmed it is actually in Canada, and much of the film is just these open fields of wheat,
yeah,
which are so stunning, beyond stunning, beyond stunning. This sort of curvature of the land and these open fields of wheat and this one house in the middle of the field. And then, of course, they head even further west to these canyons and they go down a river. And I cannot suggest that movie enough. It is really terrific, and it has inspired me to one day make the trip out to Western Canada because it just looks so gorgeous. I
oh
just
yeah.
imagine it must be so spectacular out there.
Yeah, there's I mean, a number of westerns, including Unforgiven as well, that were shot in southern Alberta.
Hmm.
I think maybe part of it might be, uh, directors found it easier to get shots in without billboards and things,
Yeah,
cluttering the view.
yeah,
It's just a little easier to, obviously you can do that, and there's a lot of pretty uninhabited parts of the American West as well, but
yeah.
it's probably easier in a lot of those places. And then, of course, now we have, well, for the last number of decades, there's been certainly currency advantages. I mean, the U.S. dollar goes pretty far up here right now, so it
Hmm.
reduces your production costs. Uh, with the case of Coward, the Jesse James Robert Ford movie, we have an area of old buildings in Winnipeg from the 1890s, and if you shoot from the right angle, you can get whole blocks of them that are these old buildings. And
Hmm.
so that was Kansas City. The Kansas City scenes in that movie were shot in Winnipeg. but some of the Western scenes were shot in southern Alberta.
Mm-hmm.
And in southern Alberta, you've got, the dry foothills with the mountains in the background that kind of, photograph very well.
Yeah.
One thing we don't have is canyons, really. I mean, we have
Yeah.
badlands, which are kind of like canyons, but we don't have anything to compare with the classic John Ford country.
Yes. Yeah,
Monument Valley kind of.
Comanche territory, where,
Yeah,
for example, Horizons,
yeah,
Clint Eastwood's new Western Horizon was filmed.
yeah. If you're going for that John Ford look, you that's the kind
Mhm.
of thing you can't get shooting your Western in Canada.
So let's talk about Dadolescence,
Oh, sure.
because Dadolescence, you're friends with Craig Turleson,
Yep.
Turley. I call him Turley, but we'll call him Craig Turleson. And Craig Turleson and I discussed what makes the great Canadian uh, novel. And as he explained it, I think he said that in order to have the great Canadian novel, it has to be sickeningly good for you. So you, of course, wrote Dadolescence, which is a novel about a father who's dealing with at-home life and feeling a bit lost, who deals with the kind of challenges of being unemployed and not having, I would say, not having a trajectory, uh, like the traditional father role of a person who's going somewhere and seeking to do something. And it's an interesting book. And interesting because, of course, as you sent me in your biography, it's a Nick Hornby with a Canadian accent. I was wondering what inspired you to write Dadolescence. What was sort of the input or the thing that really got you interested in writing a comedic book about being sort of a winding dad life, a winding stay-at-home dad life?
Well, I was when my son was young. I was working at home as a freelance writer.
Hmm.
I did different contracts for the Manitoba government, for some trade magazines. I did some writing for trade magazines, just whatever projects I could get. So
Hmm.
I'm at home working. My son's in school, and quite often I was the guy who would go and pick him up from school. We just lived a few blocks from his elementary school, so I'd go on foot and wait for the classes to end and walk him home. And I noticed there were a number of fathers doing that.
Hmm.
Also, if it was field trip day, sometimes I would sign up and be the parent coming along. And I did notice, as I say, there were a number of other fathers. Maybe they were working part time, maybe they were between jobs for whatever reason. And so I was just intrigued by that fact that there were a lot more than maybe there used to be. We live close to a university, so at least one of them was a guy who was a graduate student or PhD student. He taught part time but was working on his thesis, and so I thought of being a father, wanting to be a good role model, having the expectations of earning, which is a big thing, and also you want to be there for your kids, but you also feel you should be going ahead with your career, and the conflict of you're the modern dad, so it's okay to stay home, but you're still the dad, so you should be
Yeah.
earning a bigger paycheck. And so I was thinking of all of those conflicts, and this was also at the time when I was writing plays for the Fringe Festival, and I had this idea of doing a one-man show about the anxieties of a stay-at-home father, and my son, who was 12 at the time, was he 12? Anyway, said to me, uh, "Why can't I be in it? It can be about us."
Hmm.
And I thought about it. I thought, that's not a bad idea. So I expanded it from a one-man show to a lot of monologue from the stay-at-home father with a bunch of scenes, interactions here and there when the son would come home from school or whatever, and a way of exploring the guy's anxieties about what am I doing with my life, and I hit upon the idea of well, he doesn't think he's a stay-at-home father. In his mind, he's actually, yeah, he's working on his PhD thesis, and but he mostly procrastinates. And his PhD thesis is about stay-at-home fatherhood, and so he thinks of the stay-at-home father chores he does, the picking up from school, the meal prep. That's all participatory research into the phenomenon of stay-at-home fathers. And he gets to know some other stay-at-home fathers and observes their lives, and it becomes the story of a guy who's obsessed with others and trying to avoid thinking about his own problems.
Yeah.
And so anyway, that it was a show that we did at the Fringe Festival. It went over well, and one reviewer said, oh, it's I enjoyed it so much it should be expanded and turned into a novel, more or less. And I thought about it. I thought, yeah, maybe it should. So I expanded on the characters. I expanded on obviously his relationship with his wife, everything else that kind of goes into that, how she feels about him, and I've always been a fan of British humor and satire. So I mean, one of my favorite novelists is Martin Amis, who's a much more scathing satirical writer than Nick Hornby. But I also like Nick Hornby, and so I probably had a lot of that influence in me as I was writing Dadolescence. And so back to something Craig said when he was on your podcast. He talked about Mordecai Richler, a Canadian
Yes.
novelist, and yeah, there has been a very much a tradition in Canadian literature of writing that's meant to improve you and improve society.
Yes.
That Let's focus on this social ill. Let's focus on a person's healing from trauma. Let's focus that sort of thing. Mordecai Richler is a savagely funny satirical novelist, and being Jewish, he doesn't come from the kind of repressed Scottish Presbyterian background that traditionally was dominant in English Canadian, in Anglo Canadian culture. So, as an outsider to that, he was free to say, no, to hell with that.
Yes.
And so his most famous novel is a satirical novel called The Apprenticeship of Duddy Kravitz. Very funny, about a young Jewish man in the late 40s and 50s trying to make his way in Montreal, where divided between the French and the English are very much the repressed, Scots, and it's a very much what you have to do to get ahead in that society,
Yes.
and it's very funny, and satirical, and all of that. So my Canadian forebearer would be, that stream of Canadian writing. Although my guy's nothing like as ambitious as Duddy Kravitz.
Mm.
But just saying that there is some Canadian satirical tradition that I could draw from. But yeah, I mean, and I suppose there is a bit of healing that goes on in Dadolescence. So maybe I also do have a bit of that good for you Canadian novel tradition going on there, because that my character Bill is hurting because he feels he's a failure, and
Mm.
he feels his friends are failures, and they have to deal with that somehow. And much of the novel is his attempt to avoid that, facing that in increasingly absurd ways.
Yes. Yeah, it's interesting. I think it speaks to a whole bunch of things that modern dads experience in terms of uh of of general neurosis,
Mm-hmm.
and particularly the bringing the son to and being the coach of soccer, even though you don't necessarily completely understand the game. Uh, and,
Yeah.
and but because you're the one who's home, and because you have the time, and because it's expected of you, you do that thing,
Yeah,
which I think is really interesting.
yeah.
You know,
I mean, you're
the
caught between this.
the
Yeah,
suburban
yeah,
dad conundrum.
yeah.
Yes.
And the pressure that you don't want to be the distant father who just you know goes to work and the kid hardly ever sees. You
Yeah.
don't want to be that. You don't want to be that kind of just the authority figure that the kid's afraid of. Those sort of things that you think of the
Hmm.
old-fashioned father. You want to be the modern, supportive, involved father, but at the same time, you measure yourself against the distant. You think of the old-fashioned father who was extremely competent around the home,
Yeah.
even though he wasn't home very often, and who was completely devoted to being an earner, even at the cost of maybe family time, that sort of thing. So you feel inadequate because you're not as much of a devoted worker and not as handy with the tools, perhaps as the old-fashioned fatherly archetype,
Hmm.
and you don't maybe give yourself credit for being more involved than that archetype. So either way, you're when you're focusing on your work, oh, gee, I'm distant. I'm not as involved in my kids as I should be. When you're focusing on the kids, is, oh no, I'm not focusing on my work. I'm not as good an earner as I should be. And there is a kind of you can't win situation, which of course is something women have been dealing with for much longer. That and it's that whole thing that you really can't have it all. One way or another, you're going to find that inadequacy, that you can't do everything. And but you're thinking you should do everything, and uh,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that's certainly the case for these stay-at-home fathers. One of them is a real handyman. One of them, uh, you know, but he's failing in other respects.
Hmm.
Anyway, they're all caught between expectations and the new realities, and that the old expectations don't go away, even in face of the new realities.
I think there's the other thing I think it hits upon, and it's something that I thought about personally, as it comes to my embracing writing as a thing that I wanted to do, and my embracing publishing and trying to sell books, is when you become a father, there's a certain loss of self, I would say. The time of that you might have had and the thoughts you might have had for your own ambitions and your own desires is often adjusted to reflect wanting to be a parent, an attentive parent, a provider, and the sort of there's a transition from the center of your focus, which is often on yourself, even if you're married, to um, the needs of the kids.
Yeah.
And I think when I sit down to write, even though I do write dad lit, uh, which is about being a dad. I'm reclaiming an aspect of that myself. I'm reclaiming an element of my own independent purpose, and it's a way to pursue my ambition within the bounds of familial need.
Yeah.
And that really struck me with the book, and I really liked that about the book as a work of Dadlet.
Oh, thank you.
And yeah, it's sort of uh, I wouldn't say it uh, universal. It's a universal theme for dads. So
Well, thank
yes,
you.
well,
Dadolescence was my almost made it book. I briefly had an agent.
yes,
She pitched it to the big five. Four of them
yes,
asked to read the manuscript, so I was really enthusiastic about that.
Yep.
And that was the summer of the big economic crash. So this was 2008. She's trying to pitch it. 2009, they asked to read the manuscripts. And that year, they all rejected it. So I like to tell myself that it was because finances are so bad. At one point, the agent asked, would you be able to rewrite it and set it in the U.S.?
Yeah.
And I've been to Minneapolis a number of times since then. I think I could fake it now if I really tried, but at the time I didn't know any American city well enough that I could
Yeah.
fake it. So it's in an unnamed city, but it's clearly Canadian. As I say, if I
It
were
is
doing it
very
again, if I
Canadian.
were
It
doing
is
it
very
again,
Canadian.
I might see if I could fake it and move them. I think the obvious choice would, just because of they go fishing at one point, would be someplace like Minnesota. So
Oh yeah, almost definitely Minnesota.
yeah.
It could have been moved to Minnesota. I think that's funny. The almost made it book.
Everybody has one of those.
Yes, yeah, but here's another question. I know we're over for time, but you have successfully sold a book that you had through an independent press in Maine to the good people at Roan and Weatherford down in Arkansas, who produce a lot of really good genre stuff. How were you able to do that, to have a previously published work as part of a series and get it to a different publisher
Yeah.
who was
Well,
prepped and willing to? I think that's it defies the mold of what
yeah.
a lot of authors are told.
I got lucky. Five Star. It was an imprint of a publication of a company that mostly produces uh, large print editions of existing books. That's their bread and butter. But they did
Yeah,
have this one Western imprint. And I think their market was mostly libraries because they only ever bought hardcover rights from me. Like the
yeah,
contract specified just hardcover. And so I don't think it ever really got into the mainstream American book market anyway.
yeah.
Obviously, they sold copies to libraries, but there's no question about getting the soft cover and ebook rights. That was no issue.
Hmm.
And since I had a sequel already written at the time that Five Star decided to stop publishing new books, um, I thought, well, if I could convince somebody to redo the original, and I thought it was a long shot, but I I I won a Western short story contest uh,
Hmm.
from uh, uh, a Western magazine, and I asked them about it. It was the Lone Star Prize. Saddlebag Dispatches is the magazine. It's a magazine of the Old West, history and fiction.
Yeah.
And I said, do you guys know a book publisher that might be interested in this? And the fellow at the magazine said, well, in fact, our parent company is a book publisher, and they have published other authors who've been left as orphans from Five Star. So
Hmm.
I pitched it to them. I said, I sent them the manuscript of Prodigies, and also a summary of the sequel, and saying, because I noticed they mostly do run series books. I said, if you're interested, the rights are available, and the sequel is basically written. I just have to tinker with it a bit, and I have
Hmm.
ideas for a third. And they said, well, that's what we like, series, and bingo, it happened really fast. Just this winter, we signed the contract, and they're moving ahead with doing doing Prodigies, and then I guess a year later, the sequel, assuming that Prodigies does well enough for them, and then if the sequel does well enough, a sequel to that one. Um, at the moment, I'm thinking of three, but who knows if they really start flowing, why not keep it going? So yeah, it was luck, and I had tried other places. I was kind of despairing of it ever happening,
Yeah.
and then it happened. Lightning struck.
That seems to be the story.
Yeah.
Despair until it happens.
Yeah.
Well, Bob, thank you so much for coming on the pod, and everyone should consider going out and getting Dadolescence And also look forward to Prodigies and the Prodigies sequel from Roan and Weatherford. When does it come out?
I don't have a firm date, but they're talking about the fall. So I got to send them my manuscript for the second one and then have that conversation, I guess.
Well, terrific. Congratulations, Bob, and thank you for coming on the pod.
Oh, you're very welcome. This was a lot of fun. And I'll be tuning in and listening to your future ones as well.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. This has been the Dadlet Pod. Thank you for joining us.